Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we're going to take a look at one of the Ork's slightly more eccentric units, the Painboy. Now, name notwithstanding, the Painboy is actually a sort of doctor. His primary goal in life is to, well, I was about to say cure suffering, but that is slightly incorrect. It's more along the lines of cause suffering, but perhaps forestall death, or at the very least make death somewhat more enjoyable for the Doc himself. In Ork society, Painboys act, technically speaking, as medical personnel, although you'd be hard-pressed to find another race that would be willing to give them this particular designation. In most cases, Orks will do their damnedest to survive from any injury without visiting the doctor, and Ork physiology, being what it is, allows them to do this in most cases. A bullet wound, for example, unless it actually kills the Ork, is no big deal. In most cases, Orks that have had their limbs blown off will first try to reattach the limb by stapling it or hammering it onto the stump rather than going and to find one of the Ork's professional medical personnel, and in some cases it even works. Pretty much the only time an Ork is actually going to go and visit a Painboy for his medical expertise is either A, when he literally has no other option whatsoever, like he's literally in pieces at this point and his only real hope is to drag his mangled ass over to the Painboy's tent, or B, if after a battle said Ork has taken a crippling leg wound, for example, and is incapable of running the fuck away before the Doc catches up to him. So, what exactly does happen if the doctor gets a hold of the patient? Well, first and foremost, in most cases, the doc will require some form of payment of the patient. This is usually claimed in the form of the only universal Ork currency, namely teeth. You see, throughout an Ork's life, his teeth keep growing and keep falling out. Usually with some help from other Orks nearby, but occasionally they will fall out due to more natural occurrences. And since the stuff is readily available and is constantly replenished, the Orks figured might as well make it a currency. Now, if the Ork visits the doctor voluntarily, quote-unquote, he will, in most cases, have brought the teeth with him. The reason for this is that if he does not visit the Doc voluntarily, or lacks the prerequisite amount of teeth, the Doc will simply just take the teeth out of the Ork's screaming mouth. And this will of course occur before the procedure itself is underway, so there is no anesthesia involved in this. Well, there could be anesthesia, but that costs a little bit extra, and even then Ork anesthesia is somewhat crude, as it usually involves the Doc smacking the unlucky patient above the head with something remarkably heavy. It does require a fairly big mallet to knock out an Ork, but as long as they stop moving, that is really all the Painboy is after. And so, with his patient, well, squared up, and in most cases given a basic form of anesthesia, usually through blunt object, but in extremely rare cases, where highly advanced Orks are involved, it does occasionally even take the form of something as unusual as drugs, although even then most docs will still just whack the patient over the head afterwards, just out of force of habit. But, notwithstanding the somewhat violent anesthesia, once the Ork is finally under after one or two proper clubbings, the surgery will commence. Now, whether or not a surgery is required is entirely immaterial. The surgery is done because it is a surgery, and Painboys are massive fans of surgery. In most cases, if the Ork has a somewhat disappointing injury that can be fixed easily, the Painboy will usually invent new injuries so that he can fix them instead, because that is way, way more amusing. I mean, if an Ork comes along and wants to have a limb reattached, and he brings the limb along with him, I mean, that's just boring. You just sew it back on and that's that. It's 5 minutes work. That is not interesting at all. However, Your pet squigs and various goblin assistants do require food, and seeing as the orc just brought with him an unattached lump of meat, that is a far more effective use of it. Instead, the orc will, in most cases then, wake up with brand new enhancements. In the case of a missing arm, for example, he might find a fascinating mechanism of various pulleys, levers, steam gauges, and other manners of nonsense attached to his arm. These enhancements are usually at the very least functional, as the orcs have a rather impressive tendency to invent really awesome shit out of scrap metal. Though, nevertheless, you'll be hard-pressed to find an orc that would voluntarily give up his own arm for a contraption that might work. Alternatively, the doc might just have strapped a ticking time bomb to his arm just because he needs the teeth to pay off his wife's third mortgage and feed the squigs. And seeing as his only God-given talent on Earth is surgery, well, if there isn't a market available immediately, then the demand must simply be created. Usually, though, this isn't too big of an issue, seeing as the orcs are remarkably violent animals and will usually provide the doc with a steady stream of, granted fairly reluctant patients, but providing the doc either has people in his employ out there in the orc camp finding volunteers for him to work his dark magic on, or alternatively the doc is simply pretty damn quick on his feet and can catch those that have been ever so slightly hobbled by shellfire, for example. Docs will usually be able to find plentiful patients to work their magic on. But back to the surgery itself. This medical procedure is usually carried out utilizing a wide variety of tools referred generally to as stabby bits, and the more advanced docs might also utilize certain chemical cocktails occasionally to give the patients a form of anesthesia, but more likely to stabilize them from, death and stuff like that. Generally speaking, these various cocktails are contained in what is lovingly referred to as a earthy syringe. This might all sound somewhat rough to the uninitiated, but orcs are very tough creatures and they can survive even the most dedicated of medical procedures as long as they have been properly prepared, and the orc's wonderful internal system capable of more or less neutralizing most toxins allow the doc to pump the orc full of many fascinating brews, most of which are his own inventions. Now, granted, the experimentation phase for these various stabilizing chemicals does often involve a few dead orcs here and there, but eventually the doc will arrive at the formula that is just strong enough to keep the body alive in a panicked state, granted, and just not quite stressed out enough to die. Granted, most of these cocktails serve absolutely no medical purposes, but they make the corpse, patient, make funny noises, which is quite amusing, and it allows the goblins to focus on their work instead of getting bored cutting him up all the time, because, they have a lot of fun using the circular saws to cut up the patient, allowing the doc to do his work, but after that there's really not a whole lot for them to do, and so pointing and laughing as the patient shits himself and giggles uncontrollably is necessary. It keeps the orderlies in line, You have to think of the little guys after all. But, again, most orcs actually do survive these procedures and will actually make a full recovery. Now, this has more to do with the rather remarkable biology of the orcs rather than the attentions of the doctor, but occasionally the doctor's gentle administrations is exactly what is needed to allow the orc body to recuperate fully instead of, keeling over dead. And again, as long as the orc went to a doc of suitable repute, he is unlikely to awake with too many new enhancements, so that it won't really affect him overmuch in his day-to-day activities. However, there is a special little group of Painboyz known as bad docs. these are the doctors that perhaps have taken a little bit too keen of an interest in the more esoterical pursuits of their chosen field. They quite enjoy enhancing their patients with various new and wonderful attachments, say sewing on another head to the patient's body, or perhaps giving him a third asshole to help him spread his spores around, or perhaps attach some form of comical ding-a-dong to his crotch in imitation of the other stupider races, perhaps, or occasionally also just trying to push the boundaries of orc medical science. For example, the ever-popular squig to orc brain transplant, which usually creates one very angry squig that occasionally speaks halfway understandable Orcish, and one remarkably angry orc that doesn't speak anything particularly well, but does make a lot of noise while beating up and presumably eating the orderlies. However, though, you have to ask yourselves the rather obvious question: if the surgery is successful, which is a rather large if in and of itself, and the orc is capable of making a full recovery, then perhaps the orc might in some of these cases take, I don't know, some form of umbrage with his new enhancements. Perhaps the second head that was sewn onto his shoulders just keeps bitching at him, for example. Or perhaps he didn't really enjoy having a third arsehole drilled into his behind. These are all potential things that could happen and might possibly make an orc somewhat vengeful, mayhaps. And you would be entirely correct, which is why most Painboyz are also rather large orcs, as if they've survived this long, they've probably gotten pretty good dealing with customers that are less than entirely satisfied. Nevertheless, being a Painboy and being inquisitive and interested in ever pushing the boundaries of science is a very, very high-risk job. And this does unfortunately lead to considerable losses in the medical scene due to blunt force trauma to the back of the neck. However, if a Painboy acquires sufficient medical expertise and sufficient size to defend himself from the more angry customers, then he will eventually become a pain boss. In most cases, pain bosses have been allowed to acquire their considerable levels of expertise by being put under the direct protection of a rather massive war boss who has, for some reason or another, taken a liking to this particular Painboy. Now, this might simply be because he thinks that the various semi-orchid-looking creatures that keep stumbling out of the Painboy's huts are just really damn cute to look at, and occasionally it is because the doc saved his life in some unfortunate accident. For example, as was the case with the rather infamous orc warlord Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka. He was operated on by the mad Doc Grotznik after taking a bolt round to the head, which displaced about half of his brain matter over the local landscape. Grotznik fixed this problem by replacing a decent part of Gazgul's head with adamantium. This has later on allowed Gazgul to reconnect with his sanity in a more or less complete fashion, and comes with the added benefit of allowing him to talk directly to the orc gods Gork and Mork on a frequent basis. This blessing has naturally led Gazgul to believe that Doc Grotznik is a very valuable individual and should be allowed to satisfy his curiosity when it comes to surgery in the fullest and most unrestrained way possible. This means that Grotznik can drill as many assholes he wants in as many orc asses as he would possibly ever wish to do, with absolutely no fear of reprisal, because any orc lucky enough to get off Mad Doc Rotsnick's surgery table is going to not want to return to that particular table. And if he tries to kill Ghazghkul's favourite Painboy, well, you can almost guarantee that he's going to be returning to that table, because I'm thinking Ghazghkul would probably not be giving the poor sod the mercy of a quick death. And that has been my lore video on Ork Painboyz. A bit shorter than usual, but I blame the fact that I was recently on vacation in a very, very warm place, and being Norwegian, of course, I managed to scorch off about 15% of my body weight in the sun, so that is my excuse, and I am sticking to it. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you soon. Have a good day.